Hey everyone, welcome to the Sports Psych Show. I have a gentleman named Laurence Halsted on my show. Laurence is a two-time Olympian for the British fencing team, so he's the first Olympian on the Sports Psych Show. He competed in Rio and the London Olympics, so in his hometown games. He has been, or was a member of the British fencing team for over 10 years. And he won a silver and bronze medal in the European Championships, and he had a career best 6th place in the World Championships. So he really was an elite competitor. And interestingly, during his time competing at the very top of international competition, he experienced British fencing, if I can say fencing correctly, go from an amateur to a fully professionalised organisation, and he helped the British team qualify for an Olympics for the first time in the modern era. Laurence is now working as a performance director for the Danish Fencing Federation, and he's tasked not only with helping his fencers high perform more consistently under pressure, he's tasked with trying to achieve the same transition from to professional status as happened in Britain. So he's clearly got a very exciting role there in Denmark. So introducing Laurence Halsted. Laurence, how are you, sir? Thank you so much for coming on the Sports Site Show.
It's a pleasure, Dan. Lovely to be here. I'm great, thank you.
Did I get that biography pretty much right? Could you flavour it with any more information there for us?
That was pretty much spot on, I'd say. More flavour. I think you're quite right that the role I have now in the Danish Federation is exciting. I get. I'm one of the only two professionals in the federation at the moment, and the only one working with talent and elite. So I have a lot of autonomy, and I get to work with fencers, with athletes from 14 all the way up to top senior level, and it has its setbacks that there's no team to work with, but it's incredibly exciting, and I get a great amount of autonomy to decide how I work with these guys. So I've been able to kind of really bring myself to this role.
That's fantastic, and autonomy is so important, whether you're a performance director or a coach, just to have that feeling of freedom to be able to direct a program wherever you want to go. And I'm sure we'll touch a bit on that later. And we actually first touched base on Twitter, didn't we? And you, we didn't have a debate. We had an interesting conversation about the state of football and various attitudes around. When I say football, I mean soccer and the various attitudes around the game at the moment, which I know you're keen to touch on at some point. But hopefully, I know that you used to be, before you moved out to Copenhagen, you used to be an Arsenal season ticket, and hopefully you'll stay online, because I'm about to tell you that I grew up a Spurs supporter. So I do apologise there, but
well, I've lost a lot of my kind of antagonistic side of my footballing fandom. So I'm actually a big fan of Tottenham these days. I think they've got great players and a lovely team.
Yeah, and a real intelligent, passionate manager as well. But it would be interesting to see how Unai Emery tries to turn things around.
Yeah, well, as I mentioned to you in that Twitter debate, I went from being a fairly mad Arsenal fan with a season ticket to watching just one game on TV last year, which is partly to do with life circumstances and having other things to focus on, but also partly to do with that conversation we had about football as a sport and the players.
I promise you, we will touch on that, because I know we see things perhaps slightly different through the prisms of different viewpoints. But now your career has been fencing, and that's why I'm so keen to get you on for various reasons, because I know you have a very interesting, well-flavoured background in utilising sports psychology within your own competition, and even delivering some interesting psychological interventions now yourself within a foundation that you're working with that I know you'll be speaking about. But fencing, I'm very green when it comes to fencing. It's something that really interests me. It's a sport that really interests me. It's a sport, you'll have to excuse me, I don't know the vernacular and the colloquialisms and all the nomenclature around fencing. But I can imagine it's quite a psychological sport. You know, obviously my sport was golf, and I can imagine fencing is, at a guess. But could you sort of tell us a little bit about the psychological demands of fencing and fill us in on maybe how you went about dealing with those psychological demands?
Yeah, I'd love to. Well, first of all, I would definitely point out that fencing is probably the best sport that there is, and it's a real shame that it's not a kind of wider played sport, because it is absolutely wonderful. It has this, I think, a perfect combination of the physical. People don't often recognize or realize how physically demanding it is until they try it. It's incredibly physical. The psychology is fascinating. And the thing that I think it has combined, I mean, it has alongside other martial arts, is that it has this one-on-one, like, it adds such a depth to the experience, which is not always a positive part, because it can be so emotional because it's just you. And it's a little bit more intense than, say, tennis, because it's not mediated by a ball going over a net or a shuttlecock in badminton, for example. What you do directly affects your opponent. So every action you do, you have a sword, but the sword is basically an extension of your arm. So fencing, like all martial arts, it has this direct feedback, and it means that every win or loss or point or action against or for you is felt at this very egotistical level. It feels like you can be dominated in fencing, or you can dominate like no other sport or like no other non-martial arts sport because of that aspect of it. And similarly, you can feel, I mean, it's all on you. So a loss is all you have nothing else to go on. It just rests on you. And at the same time, wins are incredibly high because you've done it. I mean, I think that's a large part of why the psychology is so fascinating, and it's also something that I'm really kind of keen to work on with my fences, that tries to minimize the negative side of that.
That was really rich there, a very rich psychological description, and I wrote down some notes. I wrote down every action counts. Sword is an extension of my arm. Always getting feedback. I think that's fascinating. You're always getting feedback. You can dominate or be dominated. And is there an element, with that, you can dominate or be dominated? You mentioned ego, so always getting feedback plays, your ego is mediating that feedback, possibly. And is there an element here where you've got to, if we're going to use the word dominate, which is an emotive word, but let's just go with this for the time being. And this is, I just want to say it out to the audience here, this is relevant to all sports. Is there an element of having to dominate yourself, dominate your ego, to be able to dominate the opposition? If you dominate you, if you manage you get to dominate, or you get to manage the opposition. Would that be a fair statement to make?
Well, I was going to say, we're basically talking about control. So in fencing, if you're in control of the match, it feels a lot like dominating, like you are dominating or being dominated. But that ties in very well with what you just said, because if you are in control of yourself, then you can much more likely control the match and your opponent. The word dominate, you're right, it's very emotive, and that's why I used it for fencing, because just control in other sports might not feel quite so dominating, whereas in fencing, that's how it feels. It feels very much like you're being dominated or dominating. So yeah.
But you know, Laurence, if you and this is a really interesting point, because it's almost you versus you, isn't it? It's for you to get the best from yourself, for you to be able to compete effectively with the opposition. A big part of this is you versus you, which is very relevant to, say, a sport like golf, where it's very much, look, I can't control. It's different to fencing, I suppose, because you've not got that interaction with the opponent, but it's very much you versus you. You can't control what somebody else does. But I often have these conversations with sports people, but especially footballers, in as much as I had this conversation with this defender who played last week in a Premier League game, and they were playing a top free scoring team, and the immediate perception of this defender is, to tighten and go, oh, right, I'm playing them, this is going to be hard, this is going to be tough, this is they might dominate us here. And striving to change the meaning revolving around that game for that defender much more towards, okay, the opposition is the opposition. I want to take control of me, if we're going to use the word control, or I want to dominate me, my inner voice, my to a degree, my feelings, as best as you possibly can, my physiology, to give myself the best chance to take control of the striker who's on fire at the moment. So there must be, if you're going in against somebody for a 1v1 in a fencing match or game, or however you describe it, there must be an element here of, if you're playing a very, very top competitor, you've got to manage yourself to be able to manage the opposition, to be able to take control of yourself and take control of the opposition, especially against a top competitor.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that gets to the heart of a lot of what the work that I do with my fences is, to recognize that you can't control them, even though it feels, you can't control your opponent, so you must focus on how close you can get to your best. So that draws you into describing and understanding, visualizing your best, what it looks like and what it feels like, and constantly holding yourself up against that image. I wonder if that's an advantage of something like golf, where it's so obvious that you can't control anyone else or the weather or anything, so you can only focus on your own psychology. I think in fencing, people get, and probably a lot of other sports, get wrapped up in the fact that they're going to be competing against somebody, and that's a huge part of the game, and there's so many unknowns that how can we possibly prepare ourselves for what's going to come? In fact, you can prepare yourself for giving your best, for getting close to that best version of you. But it's not so obvious in fencing and in lots of sports, whereas maybe it is more obvious in golf.
If you were, and coming on the golf piece, you'd like to think that because it's just about you, that it becomes easier to just focus on you. But it's amazing how many players, and I mean very, very good players, get wrapped up in the games of other players. And obviously it's well documented that Tiger Woods in his heyday would actually heavily influence the thoughts and the feelings that other golfers would have, because they'd be so focused on, well, Tiger's up there, I've got no chance now, or it's going to be very, very tough, and he would distract them from their game. And he would, in essence, in many ways, from a biological perspective, Laurence, he would cause them to experience cortisol rushing through their stress, through their body, which is their stress hormone, and it would impact their game. Just dwelling on, you said something really interesting there in terms of focus on my performance, focus on my best performance. that's music to my ears, because and you talked about having conversations with your fencers about their best performance and helping them visualize or summon up a picture of that. When you, if you don't mind me asking, when you reflect back on your career, you're a European medalist, I think you got to 16th in the world at one stage, you were a world-class competitor. When you think about your own personal 10 out of 10 performance, when you think about you at your best, what did that look like? How would you describe you at your best?
Well, I have a very clear description of this, because in a lot of my thinking about this was kind of developed in the last couple of years before Rio, where our sports psychologist, our team psychologist, kind of introduced us to this system of effort and attitude being a part of the three controllables, but being on the day and in the moment being the only two that are relevant. Yeah. So we, as a team, sat down and thought about our description, how we described our best effort, how we described our best attitude, shared them with each other so we could all recognize what it was with each other. And then after every fight, in a team match, you kind of come on and off from the piece, the 3 against 3, but you have 9, so there are 9 matches, everyone fences everyone. So you're on and off. So we would come off and rate ourselves based on our effort and attitude. So separate of the score of the match, you would rate your own effort and attitude. So my effort description was a lot about body position. It was about how I was moving on the piece, kind of how much ground I was covering. It was... It became tighter. It started quite a wide description, and then got tighter and tighter to just like a short description of what it would feel like physically. And then my attitude would be kind of constantly focused with this fighting mindset, this fighting attitude. So that again was slowly tuned to be a very short, precise description of my best attitude that I knew how that felt.
That's really interesting, because listening to you there, Laurence, what you've done is something that I think sports psychology can do quite effectively, which is differentiating between performance and mindset. So I wrote down 3 things there from a performance perspective, and by performance for me, and every sports psychologist might be different, and every coach might be different in terms of how they define performance and mindset. But what I hear you saying from a performance perspective, there's 3 things. There's body position, there's ground covering, there's how you would move across the area that you're competing. So there's 3 things there, and I guess you're getting a picture of what 8 out of 10, 9 out of 10, 10 out of 10, if I was to use a numerical sort of measurement system, would look like. What's 10 out of 10 for body position throughout the contest? What's 10 out of 10 for ground covering? What's 10 out of 10 for my movement? So you're kind of, without trying to put words in your mouth here, you're defining what your performance looks like from that perspective. But then you're defining mindset as effort and attitude. So I want to put in 100% effort and as a positive attitude, or as focused an attitude, whatever it is, into my performance. So what I hear you say is, let's differentiate between performance and mindset. Let's define what performance looks like. Let's define what a great performance looks like. For you, that revolves around body positioning, ground covering, and moving, and then let's do that with effort and attitude. Would that be fair?
Well, I think there's a little bit of crossover there, because the body position, the ground coverage, that was under my effort description. So we used effort to describe our physical performance. Yeah. So what would it look like from the outside if I was hitting my top effort level? So that was very obvious to my teammates. Yep. And the attitude was more the mindset, which is not always so obvious. Sometimes it is. And to be you put numbers on it, and to be more specific about what we did, we would use a rating system, a numerical rating system. So I would come off and I'd say I was a 5 out of 5, or if I was a 3 out of 5, we would have a short discussion about why it was a 3 and not a 4, and what we needed to do to make it one better next time. So we did use numerical systems, and then you got a very clear understanding of what, in our case, 5 out of 5 looked like.
And yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact that the talking about body position, ground covering, and moving. You're talking about things that you can control, that are going to maximally impact the opposition. But you can control these things. You can choose to get your body positioning right. Yes, it might be influenced by the performance of the opposition, but you can choose to get your body positioning right. You can choose to cover X amount of ground. You can choose to move. And I find that's a big thing in performance psychology. So we're really centering on performance psychology right now. Control the controllables is almost cliche in sports psychology parlance, but controlling the controllables, what can I control, what can I do, what can I guarantee doing, and what do I need to focus on doing to inflict maximum damage, if you like, on the opposition.
Yep, I mean, completely agree. It might be a cliche, but it's something that I find I constantly need to bring up in conversations, because it's not always obvious to the athlete in front of me that what they're worrying about, what they're frustrated about, it makes no sense to be frustrated about or worried about or distracted about. But that's the ego, or that's the subconscious kind of doing its just whirling away in the background and making you think that this is something important for you to concentrate on.
And in terms of, so coming away from you, we've talked about what you want to do. You've defined the sort of the performance variables and the mindset stuff you want to focus on. When you're out there competing, what made your mind wander? What were your distractions, and and you might talk about the distractions that your fencers now have. What do you find crops up, and what happens subsequently to performance?
I think they're probably very common across to most sports. There were thoughts about, I mean, especially it's a lot to do with the format. So what happens if I lose, or what about if I win this? Who have I got next? Or so the referee does have an impact in a fencing match. There are subjective calls that a referee has to make, which means, and it's a very fast sport. I don't know if you heard, but the tip of a fencing sword is the second fastest object in an Olympic Games after a bullet.
Oh wow!
So it can be incredibly fast, and so it means that referees will make mistakes. So an inordinate amount of thought and emotional energy goes into what the referee's up to and what kind of mistakes he's making and how unfair it is. So I guess those, I did at one point make a long list of all the distracting thoughts that would come through my mind over a season, and I think it was 4 or 5 A4 pages long of
wow.
thought. I mean, all sorts of thoughts in varying frequency rates. But
did you find that a useful exercise to do, to list those distractions down? Did that help you in any way?
It did, actually. That was part of a really, really useful process I went through. I think it was part of the 3 R's kind of process that I was doing at the time, of where the middle R was to respond to these distracting thoughts. I think now that's been replaced. Now we're moving towards release the distracting thoughts. Okay. But at that time, I was recognizing what the thought was and then responding to them. So I had, after I'd written down all of these distracting thoughts, I then wrote down a logical response to them,
yep, which
I could kind of bring out anytime I recognized that I was having that thought. And that actually did end up being super helpful. And it took a while of going through this process of having a thought and then responding to it and having another one and responding to it. But it was about a year, within a year or so, my subconscious just stopped kind of throwing these distracting thoughts at me.
Okay.
So for a while after that, and then that was in 2010, 11, 12. So then after that, for a long time, I had far fewer distracting thoughts come up, because I think my subconscious had got used to being fairly a futile task.
That's interesting. So the process of writing things down, almost the process of kind of accepting that you have these thoughts as you compete, or recognizing that these can come in, writing them down, and then responding to those in competition, or as you would call it now, releasing yourself from them, actually over time lessened the occurrence of those, whether it's negative thoughts or distracting thoughts, so that interference. That's
definitely how I experienced it. Yeah.
What's the third? So recognise. You said 3 R's. Recognise, respond, stroke, release. What was the third?
The third is refocus. So implanting the helpful thought, which is usually something about the process, something about your game plan.
And Laurence, this is really interesting to me. Would you have that? Would you do the 3 R's? Would you exercise the 3 R's in competition whilst you are on the floor competing?
Yes, to an extent. I would have this would be part of my mental warm up. So whilst I was doing my physical warm up, I would be I would be kind of running through this part of my mental warm up. And certainly before, just in the lead up to a fight, the periods where I had time to go through a conscious thought process, and then it's very difficult to you don't generally have the time to do that in a match, in a fight. So there it had to be a lot sharper to the refocus. So I had a set of kind of processes, another set of processes for in the fight, which was much more about cue words, cue phrases that just tied me immediately back to my best effort attitude.
So with those cue words, would they be something that you would intentionally say to yourself? Or did you just have an impression of those cue words? Would you have to remember to say them to yourself? Or were they kind of bodily scans? Or were they mechanics that you just had an impression of them? How did that work for you?
They were specific words or phrases that I had to remember to say to myself. Otherwise, they didn't have the same effect. Did you often forget, out of interest? Yeah, I mean, I think it was just a practice makes perfect scenario. So at the beginning, it was very difficult to remind myself. I had a cue phrase, but after every action, when the referee stopped the match, I would have a cue phrase which was now fight.
Okay.
Which kind of incorporated that attitude and effort together. Yeah. And I had to remember to say it every time just before we were about to start the action again. And if I didn't, then I was slightly less likely to do that best version. But if I said it, then I was much more likely. And if I said it every time, then I could really hold up the top level for much longer than otherwise.
And what really interests me, I'm going to zoom out in a minute because I know I'm really interested in the areas you do around self-compassion, but this is I do apologise because this I find really, really fascinating, and you're articulating it so well. So it's great to get a lot of meat on the bone. I think it's so important for people to hear because it's something that a lot of sports competitors don't necessarily do, and it's something that sports coaches don't necessarily always appreciate. So just one last question around this. Because you're in this, as you said, the tip of the sword is the second quickest thing in the Olympic Games. It sounds like an enormously quick, instinctive sport, but the brain and the nervous system work so quickly as well. So for you to go out and have keywords, cue phrases, etc., and yes, often you deliver that to yourself between rounds or between fights. Did you, when you said now fight or now let's fight, did you kind of experience a shift in body language? Did you used your self-talk? Did you also use your body language in that moment? Right, let's fight. Did you embody that term and shift your body language, or did that kind of happen automatically, or not at all?
It was a conscious thing, certainly at the start, where it affected my whole body language and my whole mentality all in one, and I can't overstate how how useful it was as a tool, because I think a lot of those times when you kind of just, your level just dips, is just a focus thing. It's just a forgetting to be in that there and then. Yep. So just having that cue was just a reminder, remember, this is what I want to be doing. And it just needed that cue of now fight to put me back into that mindset. And then after doing that some thousands of times and over many competitions, then I found that I was doing it automatically, and I didn't need to use the cue anymore. So in the 2 years before Rio, I wasn't using cue phrases because it was so ingrained.
What do you think stopped you going? So you got to world number 16 with that red stat.
In the rankings, yeah.
Yeah, and you competed in the Olympic Games, and you won medals in the European Championships, so you performed at an extraordinarily high level. Why weren't you world number one? What stopped you? Or was it something that didn't stop you? It just, do you feel that you couldn't have gotten there from a physical perspective, a technical perspective? What's the difference, Laurence, with the world number one? Why weren't you world number one? Sorry, it's a strong question, but I'm fascinated by it.
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about that recently, especially since retiring. What stopped me, and thinking from this point of view for my own fences, what will make them get to world number one or not. I don't have a better answer than that. I don't think I wanted it as much as those other guys. I think I always had fencing as a part of my life, and was also, it didn't drive everything I did. So I also wanted to have close friendships, and I go to university, and I just wonder, this is the best answer I can come up with, is that I probably had some potential to be there, but I just didn't want it. I wasn't as determined as those other guys.
That's really interesting. So what do you think those guys, if you think about the top three, the top in the world, the top three, the top five in the world in fencing at the time when you were competing, and they may still be there now, what did they do with that want, Laurence? What did they do? You've talked about, well, I wanted to have close friendships, I wanted to go to university. So what do you think, from your expertise, from your knowledge, from your experiences, what do you think they did with their want that, say, you want to help your fencers do?
I think it was just a more of a single-mindedness towards that point. I guess I never really, as growing up, there wasn't an option to be a professional fencer in the UK, so that was never a dream of mine. And then it became a possibility before when we won the bid for the London Olympics. And then I started seeing myself as a fencer, but I don't remember ever having a single-minded focus, like drive towards being the number one in the world. Okay. And that must be a big factor in the guys who get there, in that it will translate into their everyday life, into their everyday training. So they will have optimized absolutely every bit of it for many years, and will just be searching everywhere they can to make those improvements. And I think I had times of doing that, yep, certainly for some years as well, but it wasn't my entire career that I was so laser focused on just getting to the top.
So would that, when you said I had times of doing that, is that things like diet and sleep and quality of practice? That's got to, I mean, I found in my career as a sports psych and previously a coach, a competitor, in golf, that the quality of practice mediates, your ability to sustain focus, to balance criticism with being positive, the attention to detail during training, in and around training, the analysis, the reflection, the utilization of feedback. When you're talking, I'm kind of getting an image of those kind of things that you may have been a little bit inconsistent with.
Yeah, I think certainly for the first part of my professional career in fencing, I was not doing everything I could have done to be better over the first few years, and that was at the same time that our organisation was starting the process towards professionalisation. So the setup wasn't quite there yet either, and then probably for the year or two before the Olympics, I was highly dedicated and doing everything I could do, and looking everywhere I could. But I think that was also a period of transition for me, where I came across a lot of these things that we're talking about now, a lot of the sports psychological approaches that helped me so much. And I was already 26 when I really got my first kind of deep insight into a sports psychology approach that I really appreciated, that really kind of inspired me. And bearing in mind that I'd studied psychology at university, I had an interest in it already, but it took me that long to really find the sports psychological approach that made a big difference.
Why? Because if you studied psychology and you wanted to get the best out of you, what was it that you just didn't connect the dots? Was it that it wasn't a provision of British fencing at the time, and that meant you didn't connect the dots? Why? And why do you think? I suppose that the bigger question there is because the reality is there's a lot of sports competitors at every level who would dismiss sports psychology is an applicable tool for them to help them get the most out of it. So why didn't you do it until late, and why do you think people don't?
Yeah, I think there was back then in 2007 similar to now. There was less appreciation. There's not a huge appreciation in British fencing. They were starting to work with it, but it wasn't. It comes as a late kind of third or fourth behind technical, tactical, physical training. So we did work with sports psychologists. They wouldn't. What there was just didn't catch me. I never actually had a sports psychology module in university.
Yep.
But then the right psychologist is also quite personal, as I'm sure you found, that individuals will relate specifically to other sports psychs and to specific models or approaches, and this one just kind of came together in the right person and the right approach that really grabbed me. And now, I think partly in response to that I am somebody who is incredibly open to sports psychology or to psychology generally. Didn't kind of get into it until 26, midway through my career. Has certainly influenced me to try and work on this much younger. I do a lot of. I have a great sports psych kind of focus, even with our first kind of teams entering the national team level at 14, 15.
Yep.
I think I put it at a much higher level of importance, and I think, in fact, most people at any level that they're at, most of the athletes have trained at the national and international level. Let's say they've all trained fairly hard. They're all fairly physically fit. It's the psychology, is the way who can control their emotions, their mind, their mindset the best, that decides the winner. So I think it actually could sit closer to the top of the pyramid of importance for actually kind of getting results, but many things on top of that.
Yeah, and the way I describe it, so if we've got models over here sports coaching models that sort of tend to work in corners. So if you can imagine a circle, and the top left-hand side of the top left of the circle is the tech-tac, top right is physical, bottom left is psych, and the bottom right is social. And I always say, well, I sort of propose, or have tried to start a revolution around, let's actually deconstruct that model, and actually let's see, I think, the truth of the matter from a performance and a progression and a participation perspective is that the psychosocial side of things drive the other areas. They drive the technical, they drive the tactical, they drive the physical. How can I express my physicality without the ability to manage the psychological side? How can I execute technique and learn technique, without being a great focuser, somebody who can manage emotions? And so I really think those areas are so important, and they're also, the psychosocial is so important to be able to deal with the day-to-day challenges that elite level and developing elite level sports people have, and even very young competitors. And I want to read, I know that your focus, direction and passion revolves a lot around an area of psychology called self-compassion. And I just want to read, you've done a really insightful, I really enjoyed reading an article you've got up on the True Athlete Project website, which I know you're going to discuss as well with me. And so I'm just going to read, it's quite a long passage, so bear with me, but I think it's really important to get across. So you say, athletes all too commonly beat themselves up for making mistakes or disappointing results, and that in turn takes a psychological toll, potentially affecting following performances. They also tend to be their own worst critics, much harsher on themselves than they would be to a teammate in the same position. Athletes think they need to feel this way. That their capacity to criticize themselves is an integral part of why they are successful at their sport. They rationalize that it forces them to work harder, because they hate losing so much, and they can't be satisfied with anything less than perfect. Underneath this rationalization is the worry that if they didn't feel awful after making mistakes or losing, that would mean they don't care enough to perform well. I should know, having had that exact mindset for much of my sports career. I used to take losing deeply to heart. At the same time, I almost welcomed the pain, because it showed how much I cared and how much I wanted to be better. And that resonated with me so much, because it's like, hey, you're the fencing equivalent of me. Now, you were a much better fencer than I was golfer, I can assure you, Laurence, but you're like the fencing equivalent of me, where it's like, you've almost, because we're so socialised into outcome and performance in sports, and by that I mean the outcome of win and lose, we define competition as winning and losing. And we define, we're then about, well, I've got to perform, I've got to high perform. And we put so much pressure on ourselves with outcome and performance that we kind of define it as, look, if I lose, it's terrible, it's awful, it's horrendous. I no longer deserve to be doing this sport or getting my funding or whatever it may be. And you kind of feel you have to put up this facade that you've got to be devastated. I mean, I cared deeply. I wanted to do well. But I put on this facade of absolute devastation. And I didn't give myself permission to go, you know what, look, what did I want to try and do here from a mindset and performance perspective? Did I do it? Yes, I did. Didn't get the result I wanted. That's okay. Let's be intelligent today, tomorrow, next day about my practice and move on. Talk to me about that paragraph, what that means to you and stuff you're doing with the True Athlete Project.
Yeah, well, I guess it's important to point out, and certainly through the True Athlete Project, my passion is in highlighting the character development aspect of sport over the outcome focus, because this will maybe connect us later on to the wider argument of the meaning of sport for individuals and for society. But certainly, yeah, I spent way too long even as a senior in my professional sports career, being absolutely broken by losing competitions that I didn't think, or results that I didn't think I didn't want, and at the same time feeling like that's a good thing. That means something. That means it means something to me. And then I went through this process also at the same time of working with this sports psychologist back then in 2011-12. It was actually in the Olympic year in 2012 in January. So we'd been preparing for this since 2007 when we won the bid. We knew we would have a host nation place in the Olympics, and I was number one or two. I was number two in the rankings, so I was in the team for all these years. And then in January of 2012, I tripped over in a training match at home and broke my fencing arm wrist. So that was the first year after five years of looking forward to the London Olympics. I broke my wrist when the first time we'd stepped in, literally in the first training session back in January of Olympic year. And it was just an incredibly dark period for me. I mean, as you can imagine, I had 2 surgeries to put wires and screws in my wrist, and I couldn't do any fencing training for 4 months. Until May, where the Olympics was in August, and then I could only physically train and work with this sports psychologist. And during that whole time, I had no idea whether I'd come back to any level of fencing, let alone an Olympic level. So a lot of what I did with our sports psychologist was working on my values and working on what there is to gain from what I'm doing now, from training as hard as I've ever trained physically and mentally, perhaps without any option for getting a result, perhaps without even competing at the end of it. And that totally changed my perspective on all of it, that I had to find some value in the process, in everything else, regardless of the result, because it might not even be an option in the end. So that kind of, I did end up getting back into the team, but as a reserve, and I competed in London, and I was proud of the way I performed that day, but I was much more proud of the way I'd kind of shown a strength of character throughout that period. And it wasn't all great. I had some pretty periods that I wasn't proud of as well, but I managed to pull myself through and kind of be a positive supporting teammate that my team needed in that period as well. And that kind of has triggered, since then, it's triggered this whole kind of flood of interest, of thoughts about what sport means, what the value of sport is. And I come around to self-compassion as an aspect of that sport has to develop our characters. What we're seeing at the moment around the world of athletes getting burnt out, getting depressed, this amazing and sad story of the British cyclists after the London Olympics who had to go on, half of the gold medal winners had to go on antidepressants after the Olympics because of how much of a downer it was after that. I mean, that signals to me that it's not living up to its value proposition. It's not doing enough, and that's what we need to turn things back towards, is away from the win at all costs approach, away from the outcome focused approach, much more onto the process and much more onto the character development side of things. So, and through that, I mean, very personally, through that process in the London Olympic year, my entire mindset had changed, and I actually took because of how draining that period was, I took a long break after the London Olympics and only came back to competing 2 years later. But I had a completely kind of revolutionized approach to it, and I just no longer took defeats as harshly. I used to cry after these competitions, be outside the venue in tears because of how devastating it was. that just wasn't there anymore. And I found that I could give absolutely as much effort and my best fencing came at that period without suffering if it didn't go to plan. So I had these two kind of periods in my life, one where I got through that difficult time in the London Olympics, and the other where I realized that I didn't need that to perform my best. And in fact, I was much freer, I was enjoying my competing much more because I didn't have this fear of what happens if I lose this. I mean, that just wasn't weighing over me anymore. So I could go out and be a much freer, much more high performing fencer, I thought. There's the long answer.
No, it's fantastic and fascinating and compelling. And what I hear you say, if we take the cyclists as an example, and I must say it's very important for me from an ethical perspective to say, look, I wasn't involved, never have been with British cycling, and I know that there are some challenges post Olympic Games and there tends to be for all Olympians. So for British cycling, it's all Olympians and people with ambition. Would you say, you use these terms identity and values, would you say in sport, aspiring elite competitors, maybe even younger competitors who probably aren't even in a position to think about being aspiring elite or being elite, identity and values, that as a fencer for a long time your whole identity revolved around I am a fencer, and subsequently all of the values in your life, or most of them, revolved around being a fencer, and so subsequently that didn't necessarily lead to your burnout because you did something about it, but that is where the challenge is to help people extend their identity and have character values around character strengths and other areas in their life, to be able to, yes, compete and compete better, but also to live a full, rich life in their sport and away from their sport.
Yeah, I think we know that this is a lot of the work that we're doing in the True Athlete Project. Identity and values is one of the modules in our mentoring program. But we know that having an identity which is entirely wrapped up in just one thing, it can be anything, but in our case it's in your sport,
yep,
it's not healthy, because a sports career, every single sports career goes up and down, it just has downs as well, and if your identity is wrapped up in that, it's too kind of susceptible to the downs, then your whole self can be brought down by it, and that shouldn't be possible. So what we would ideally say, and what the True Athlete Project we're trying to do, is just highlight get young athletes especially to highlight the other areas that they care about in their life. They could be family or friends or interests, hobbies, especially studying, university and school. But it really can be anything, and just recognize that there are other aspects of you that don't rely on your sporting performance to feel like a valid kind of important human being for yourself. And then the values aspect, I think, again, because you cannot control the outcomes, you can do a lot. You can control the control of the preparation and the input, but you can't determine in advance what the outcomes are going to be. So you need to be able to recognize the benefit from going through all of that process, so that you have been strengthening your values along the way, and you recognize that you're getting something out of this, all of this input, even if the result goes against you or goes badly. You understand how much you've gained regardless of that, and that's a lot of the work that I'm doing with my athletes and also with the True Athlete Project.
So let me be clear, there is a big part of your coaching that is invested and is invested in results, and has to be because you're striving to turn the Danish Fencing Federation, if that's the right term, from an amateur sport into an amateur body into a professional one. So you are invested in results, but a part of striving to attain results is to help your fencers, your athletes, broaden their identity, become more attuned to values away from sport.
Yeah, and I guess is another way I'm lucky that we're not. This is not a federation that is used to Olympic gold medal winning performances. We haven't had an Olympic fencer in the modern era, so there isn't a huge pressure on me in my role to deliver constantly world class results. That is the aim, but I have some of the freedom to try and to make sure that we create much more holistic athletes. And being in Denmark, there is a greater understanding of that. The sports system is set up like that pretty well anyway. But on top of that, I recognize from my time in sport that sure, we can desperately want results, but it doesn't make any difference unless you focus on the process of it. So I bring that into my professional career, and I focus on all those other things that I think will help our athletes perform and eventually get results. But that definitely includes the psychosocial side of things, because for a start, if that's not in place, then we won't have athletes as seniors. They'll have dropped out. They'll have found it too strenuous, too emotionally draining. They won't be there anymore. They'll be burnt out. They'll have chosen other things. They'll be just like with injury prevention. If you don't train that stuff, then you don't have athletes to perform. So I definitely see it as building this other side, these other aspects of their identity is fully in line with this kind of aim to get better results, because I mean that's my philosophy around sport performance anyway.
I think a big part of this is, and this is my view, is that coaches can misunderstand the notion of mindset, and because we use this term, and I mean a competitive mindset, because we use this term mental toughness. We use this term mental toughness, and I've been guilty of using it in the past, but what I've come to learn, believe, and promote is mental skill. And I think that competition requires mental skill. Every single sport requires mental skill. For me, somebody would have to be extraordinarily nimble intellectually to persuade me otherwise. Sport is biological. It's driven by your biology, your nervous system, your neurobiology, which drives your psychology, which drives your behaviours, and so it requires mental skill. And I think that coaches confuse themselves when it comes to this at times. And I'm not having a go at coaches here. I've been a coach myself. I still am a coach. I think that coaches think, you've got to be tough, you've got to be tough, you've got to be tough. That player's weak, that player's weak, that player dwells on mistakes, he's weak or she's weak, and that player finds it challenging to focus. And all these mini psychological factors are mental skills. I think you can lack mental skill and then develop mental skill. I think you can be high in mental skill and lose mental skill if you don't continue to work on it or maintain it. So I think mental toughness, the term mental toughness, my realisation in my world, and you may see it slightly differently, is we get so semantically, we get so trapped in this world of, as a top athlete, you've got to be mentally tough. I'm not so sure. I just think you've got to be mentally skillful. And I think when you have when you expand your identity, when you have other things in your life in a healthy way, when you are not catastrophizing and overgeneralizing, and you don't get stuck in the musts. I must do this. I must be like this. Then I think that promotes mental skill. It helps you be mentally skillful in competition because you can relax, you can be calm, you can be intelligent, you can be nimble with your responses. So when I listen to you, Laurence, I suppose we all wrap things up in different packages, and my package as a sports psych is when I'm thinking about the well-being piece of a human being, of a footballer, a golfer, an athlete, an Olympian sitting in front of me. When I think of well-being, I'm thinking of them as a human being and them having a happy life, being happy within themselves, but also when they've got that, they're able to drive greater mental skill.
Yeah, I would have no arguments with that. I think I see it exactly the same. That there's a lot of power behind the negative emotions in sport performance, and they just, I think, as they show, as has been shown, they kind of raise cortisol levels. They stop you from being able to be aware and kind of coldly analytical in a good sense, and they drive all this kind of catastrophic thinking. That's where I see this self-compassion piece coming in very handy, is that they will allow for a much stronger psychological foundation on which to build all these other skills. It's just wonderful. I was a big proponent of mindfulness also earlier in my career, and when I started researching self-compassion, I found out that mindfulness was one of the three parts of self-compassion. Mm-hmm. And it's the same. I think that kind of ties in with what I was saying, that if you practice mindfulness, it gives you this awareness and this ability not to be drawn into the emotions and the distracting thoughts.
Can you briefly, sorry to interject, Laurence, can you briefly explain to us how you might practice mindfulness, or how would an Olympian practice mindfulness? What do you mean by mindfulness?
Well, mindfulness, I think it's gaining popularity now, and it has been around in high-level sports since quite commonly since the 70s, and I think the Chicago Bulls were using it in Jordan's time. Mindfulness is simply kind of practicing being present and aware without getting wrapped up and getting caught by your emotions and your thoughts, and just noticing what's going on in your mind and not getting led off by them. So the standard practice, which I mainly do, is sitting and focusing on breathing for 10, 15 minutes, half an hour. And there are all sorts of other exercises. There's a body scan where you focus on different parts of your body, which can be great for recovery. You can listen to sounds. You can yoga is a mindful exercise. That's what I do these days. There's a lot of yoga, and it's, again, I find this is one of the things that I look back on my career and I'm incredibly grateful for, is the mindfulness training that kind of gave me an awareness and a value that I use in the rest of my life, and it affects me as a person and also benefited me as an athlete. And this is where the self-compassion, where mindfulness, where giving back, these values of giving back to the community, all these kind of character values, I see as this is the way we want to go, because they benefit performance, but they also tie into value as just value for the individual doing sport and doing these practices, and they can then show value for these athletes to society.
I'm going to, you sort of alluded to the work you're doing with the True Athlete Project, and you've mentioned bits and pieces about that. I'm going to finish off, I'm going to come back to that to give you an opportunity to talk just a little bit more about that. But I suppose my final question is, to challenge you slightly on some of the stuff you said, because I'm interested, because we're compadres here. I'm with you in everything you've said, and I know that my work more and more is seeing the performance psychology piece interrelated and integrated into the well-being piece, if you like. And I think they're synonymous. I really do. So I'm with you. I think it's challenging, because let me go back to something you said earlier, where you said, when we talked about the difference between yourself and the world number one, or getting to the very top, and that's, hey, you got to world number 16. I was about world number 45,000 at golf, so you got slightly ahead of me there. But that wasn't that bad. You said I didn't want it as much. My whole life, my life didn't revolve around it as much as those guys. How does that tie in with this idea of extending your identity and having values and growing in sport outside of competing, outside of wanting to be the best? Because the two don't seem congruent. How do you explain that one away?
I think you're right. I think they aren't particularly congruent. I would bring up, I have been thinking about this a lot, I would bring up the question of whether it is worth striving to be the world number one if it destroys you as a person. And people will have different answers, and it's obviously not going to necessarily destroy you as a person to be world number one. And there are examples of the best in the world who are highly aligned with, highly kind of clearly in this place of well-being. And I don't know, you look at Roger Federer or LeBron James, who seem to have this, all of it together. I think personally, I would not recommend one of my athletes driving themselves to be the best in the world to the detriment of all else. So for me, there's not enough value in just being the world number one and being Olympic champion if it doesn't also come in alignment with other human individual goals, kind of values and character development. So I think some people get an advantage by sacrificing too much in that thirst for the very top. It's also clear that you can do it without sacrificing everything, without being destroyed at the end. And there are lots of examples of that around us at the moment. But I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on that, if you're on the same side of the table as me.
Yeah, I think the last thing you said, I think it's complex. I think it's individual specific. I don't think there's a general answer there. I think it's having programs, whether they're Olympic programs, whether they are Premier League programs, cricket whichever sport programs in academies, that introduce the psychology piece and take that seriously, the psychosocial piece, and having upskilling coaches in this area, because I think that when you are upskilled in this area, I think that the two can work hand in hand. I think that, as you said, there are examples of people out there. There are examples of athletes who have both, who have enormous amounts of well-being, are high, what psychologists might call high-functioning people, high-functioning individuals, and they're world number one, or they're in the top 10, or they're at a top team. So absolutely, it can be done. I think it requires an enormous amount of flexible thinking. I think it requires the ability to know what you've got to do in training, and when you're in training, do that to 100% and build the capacity to do that to 100%. Have the daily structures in place, have the right nutrition, diet, have the right physical training, have the right exposure to psychology. It's essentially the right holistic training. And then when you leave your sport for the day, you leave your sport for the day. And have the capacity to switch off and have something else in life. I believe Olympic champions can have other things in life. I believe that world number ones can have other things in life. They can have a family. They can have other interests. But when they do have to spend a disproportionate amount of time doing their sport, sometimes more disproportionate than other times, but they have to have the capacity to go, right, I've done my work now I'm going to rest and recuperate. And part of rest and recuperating is family time, friends time, is hobby time. And I believe if you have intelligent processes in place that utilises emotion for the good of your performance, that utilises emotion within motivation to drive you to get out when it's a wet Wednesday morning and you don't want to if you've got an outdoor activity that you're doing, and focus and work on being a real good focuser when you're training. Stretch yourself, come out your comfort zone, learn how to learn how to be coached, be coachable. Work on psychological cues and techniques and tactics and things like that. Be a student of the game when you have to be. Be a student of your game. Be accomplished at self-skills, self-aware, self-managing, self-reflection. See, when you talk about it, there's so many little things you can do. But it doesn't mean you can't have friends. It doesn't mean you can't have a family. It doesn't mean you can't have a hobby. But in many respects, you have to be high-functioning because you've got to be able to compartmentalize those things. And then it's that, whether you call it self-compassion piece, or I spoke to somebody on this podcast a few weeks ago, rational motive behaviour therapy, where you rationalise things a bit more. If you've lost, you've lost. You're going to lose. You're going to lose when you compete in sport. And you have to give yourself permission to lose to be able to win. You have to give yourself permission to lose to be able to improve your performance, because you learn most from those. It's a cliche to say, but you do. So devastation around lost performances is actually irrational, and it doesn't help you. It makes you worse. So I think I'm kind of thinking as I'm speaking here, Laurence, because I just think it's so important. I'm kind of rationalising it and learning about it in my own mind. I do think there is congruency between the two. I really do. I think it's challenging. It's challenging to find that congruence, challenging to find that balance, that sweet spot. To finish off here, if we still have an audience after that ramble, the True Athlete Project. Tell us a bit about that, and tell us how people can get hold of you, how they can get involved with you.
Yeah, so it's a fantastic non-profit organisation, started a couple of years ago by a great guy called Sam Parfit. And when you brought up that idea of if we'd had that holistic development program around us as up-and-coming juniors, it would have changed things. I envisaged that at the time and thought, I think that would have made a huge difference. And that's what we're doing at the True Athlete Project. We're trying to bring this holistic approach to athlete development. So I'm the co-director of the mentoring program, which pairs Olympians, Paralympians, and elite athletes, older, not necessarily retired, but older, mature athletes with young, aspiring, kind of up-and-coming athletes, and leads them both through a year-long, quite pioneering, holistic program with 5 modules on performance, identity, values, mindfulness, which has its own, then society and responsibility, and nature and connectedness. So this it all ties. We think it's about growing the person. You create better people to create better athletes, to create better sport-specific athletes, and it all ties in under it. Both creates better people, but it creates the better performance as well. So that's the mentoring program. We also have in the zone mindfulness workshops, and we're basically growing up. It's a startup non-profit, but it's got all of my attention and my passion involved in it, because I think with the state of elite sport at the moment, and there's kind of crises from the very top level all the way down almost, we need to re-envisage sport and sport culture. And we at True Athlete Project, we think it should be a more compassionate, more mindful, and more holistic kind of process and holistic culture. And and I truly believe that doesn't have to, that not only will it not take focus away from the performance, if done well, it will improve performance. For all of those reasons that you pointed out, that the psychosocial, that it just builds, it gives the foundation. It's what everything else is built on top of, and I think it's fairly pioneering. There have been people talking about this kind of thing, but we want to revolutionize the whole culture of sport, and I'm just proud to be a part of it, and we're growing, and the mentoring program's been going brilliantly. So check it out and join one of the programs we have.
And so how can people, if you've got a Twitter account, how can people sort of look you up and follow you?
Yeah, well, the True Athlete Project has social media, and it's also on the trueathleteproject.org.
Yep.
I'm on Twitter as well, not hugely active, but I do jump in every now and then, and I'm glad I jumped in on your that time.
What's your handle, Laurence? What's your Twitter handle?
I'm just Laurence Halsted, I think.
Okay, cool. Well, Laurence Halsted, thank you so much for joining me. That was absolutely brilliant. Everyone, that's Laurence Halsted. Wasn't that awesome? I really learned so much there, and it just demonstrates, just to hear somebody who's been in that Olympic circle, that under all that pressure, and just to hear, at the start of that conversation, the kind of tools and techniques that Laurence used to be able to perform under pressure, and then zooming out from the specific sports psych tools and techniques towards bigger well-being areas such as self-compassion and values and identity. And hopefully from our conversation there, you're all getting a clearer picture of that balance between performance and well-being, performance and mindset, and actually your performance doesn't have to suffer. In fact, it thrives when you feel good about yourself, when you have more to life than just your sport, and you have more interests and hobbies, and life is that much richer. You will perform better, you will thrive. So thank you very much to Laurence there. As always, if you enjoyed the podcast, it would be great if you can give it a rating and perhaps even a review if you have time. And don't forget that you can subscribe to the podcast to listen to future editions. So I hope you enjoyed today. I really did, and I look forward to seeing you next time on the Sports Psych Show.